All right. So welcome to the Motivation and Behavior Change track. Thank you all very much for coming. I am Dustin DiTomaso. I run the Behavior Change Design discipline at MadPow. And I've been doing this track here at HXR for, I don't know, the past 5 or 6 years. And today is a really special day for me, being able to have the lineup that we have today. We often think about motivation and how to motivate others in health, in design. We'd all love people to have motivation for the things that we want us to do. And in my experience, there are lots of assumptions in lay theories and techniques about how to motivate others and what motivation is, and lots of discussions around the best way to do it. And for me, I got my start thinking about motivation, I'd say about a decade ago, in a former life as instructional designer in educational technology, trying to think about how to motivate learners. And I stumbled upon a theory called self-determination theory, and it opened up a whole new world for me for how to think about design, how to motivate others, how to work with people to help them to achieve the goals that they are interested in achieving, and found a lot of connection, support, stimulation, and open arms from that community. I've got some fantastic people who have influenced my work, have influenced the work and the way that we approach designing for change at MadPow, and really pleased to have those folks. So we're going to do individual presentations, 2 minutes of Q&A, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll have a panel for open questions. So if you have a question directly related to a speaker's talk, feel free, we'll take them. And then more general and open questions and discussions around the content that we cover. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer LaGuardia, who's a clinical psychologist at UCSB. She's also a healthcare consultant at Motivated for Health. And she's just published a book called Self-Determination Theory in Practice, which is amazing. I think it is relevant to all of our work, and it takes motivation and behavior change in theory and puts it in a way that's easily digestible and immediately applicable to, I think, the work that most of us in here are interested in and doing. So with that, please welcome Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Dustin, for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here, and also be really pleased to be a part of this lineup. So part of my job today is to really start off this program by helping to introduce you to self-determination theory, because what you'll see in the upcoming presentations is the application of this theory into real-world interventions that are going on. So I want to start, though, with the first kind of piece or question about why should we care before we even get to SDT. Why should we even care? I don't know why that's not working. Why should we even care about motivation? So, you know, when we're designing interventions and we're thinking about how to create the most effective interventions, one of the main things we want to be thinking about are 2 questions, right? The questions are, why do people get started in making a health behavior change, and then what keeps them going? These 2 questions, if we start with those, they're fundamentally about motivation. And so what we want to be doing is thinking about how can we leverage 40 or more years of motivation science to bring it to bear on how we design our interventions and begin to develop programs that help people to make the behavior changes that they want. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SDT. How many people know a little bit about SDT? Okay, so some, but not a whole lot. Many of you may not recognize that you actually know more about SDT. For instance, if you've read Dan Pink's book, Drive, it's entirely based on SDT. And a number of other companies and other kinds of interventions focus on SDT as one of their core kind of foundations. So I'm going to introduce you to the science behind it and also help you to understand a little bit about what SDT has done in terms of changing and innovating how we think about motivation. So this is not working very well. It's okay.
Yeah, it's the right side.
Okay, thanks. So in the basic SDT model, we talk about the idea that we need to create a need-supportive environment. And to the extent that we create that need-supportive environment, that's actually going to lead to people having a more internalized and kind of ownership over their behaviors. They're also going to feel more competent about those behaviors. And that's also going to lead to better health outcomes. Now, I went through that very fast, but I want to actually break this down, this model, into the more individual components so I can help you to understand a little bit more about what we mean by each of these things. So let's first start about what does it mean to create a need-supportive environment. Most interventions, most kind of products, most kind of things that are out there really focus on this one particular need. So it focuses on the need for competence. The need for competence refers to the idea that people need to feel a sense of mastery or affectance over their own behaviors. Some people use the term self-efficacy, right? And affectance or this competence is best served when we create an environment in which we help people to kind of create the skills and develop those skills. We stretch them, right, to the place of where we're optimally challenged. So they're not overly challenged, but they're not also bored. So it's allowing them to begin to kind of push their behaviors in a little bit of a different direction. We do that through creating different kinds of matched skill-based interventions. We create opportunities for people to design action plans and begin to implement those and then revise those as well. And more importantly, we also help them in the context of this to deal with the disappointments, the inevitable disappointments that are going to happen, and how do we kind of get back engaged with the behavior and maybe change up that plan or change up those goals in order to engage the behavior more effectively. But there's plenty of things that we can do that we're perfectly capable of doing and that we don't do them, right? Because we need another component here. We actually need to feel ownership over those behaviors. We need to feel an investment in those behaviors. The need for autonomy, it actually refers to the idea of being self-authored, right? That's the derivative of this idea. And the idea is about having willingness to engage in a particular behavior, feeling choiceful, feeling volitional, and feeling ownership over the behavior. So how do we do this, right? One of the things that is the opposite of autonomy is the sense of feeling controlled or pressured. So the idea is that someone from outside or what you've swallowed whole, right, for those messages about the shoulds, you have to, you must, right, is the opposite of autonomy. So we want to create an environment in which we're trying to help understand people's perspectives, we're trying to understand their own goals, what's meaningful to them, and help them to cultivate not only what those goals are, but how they go about actually achieving them, right? Which can look very different for different people. Now, those two needs are great. They help you along with, engaging in different behaviors. But one of the big things that we need to pay attention to as well is the fact that these behaviors don't happen in a vacuum, right? So when people are changing their health behaviors, they're changing them in the context of their social environment. Their social environment, which is going to impact not only how their behaviors are being enacted at the moment, but also if they start to change them, they're going to buck against those oftentimes. And so one of the things we need to be paying attention to in our interventions is how do we help people navigate these changes in the real world and the real consequences of those changes for their interpersonal environment. More importantly, the need for relatedness really refers to the idea of feeling a sense of belongingness, a connectedness, or a welcome, right, with others. Not simply being valued for whatever you produce. So if I lost the weight, or if I, did so many minutes of physical activity, or I changed a particular behavior, you want to look at the whole person. And so one of the key pieces around why relatedness is so important, especially in the initial the initial kind of interventions is that it helps around this idea of engagement. When people feel like things are going to be tough, right? If they have people that feel welcomed or an intervention that feels like they've got your back, that then they're going to be more likely to come back, to persist in that, and to use that resource as a way to help them to continue to engage that behavior. So each of these three needs becomes an important component, and the ways in which we design interventions become important components of how to create a positive environment for behavior change. As I mentioned, what the model suggests is that if we create this more need-supportive environment, this is going to lead to actually two really important internal processes. One is a more autonomous form of self-regulation. So, and I'm going to explain that in a moment, but also a sense of perceived competence that I can actually go about and do these behaviors, like I have the skills to do them. Let me spend a moment talking about what autonomous regulation means. So it used to be the case that when we thought about motivation, we thought about it in this dichotomous way. Either you have it or you don't, right? But what we realized over 40 years of research is that motivation for a particular behavior is actually much more differentiated than that. And it actually matters about this differentiation. So for any given behavior, let's say, for instance, wanting to be more physically active or to lose weight, right? There's a whole host of reasons of why people engage in that behavior in any moment. So they range from things like, I have direct pressures or rewards of why I'm engaging in this behavior. So if I exercise more, it's going to help cut down on my, my healthcare bills, or be able to take less medications, right? So there's a direct punishment if I don't actually do the behavior. There's also direct punishments like my spouse is going to nag me if I don't stop eating this particular bunch of chips or whatever it might be. People don't actually need those direct punishments and rewards like hanging over them. We have this wonderful thing where we get to internalize those little voices in our head. We all realize those are the shoulds, the pressures, the you have to, you must, right? So we don't need to bring our spouse along or our partners along or our friends along. We already have those voices in our head about what we should do, right? So I need to change my behaviors because otherwise I'm going to feel really guilty if I don't. They're not going to like me, right? They're not going to think I'm as attractive. They're not going to value me as much if I don't change these behaviors. Now, there's also a lot of other reasons that people might engage in health behavior change that are more, I would say, positive, right? People can actually value the health behavior itself. So the fact is that I might value my own health, and so physical activity is one way that I can actually enhance my health and be able to function better. I also might find it really interesting or fun, so there might be challenges around that or things that I enjoy about physical activity. Why is it that we need to differentiate these different motives, right? Because people come into our clinics, they start our apps, they get onto different programs, they have all of these motivations active. And in fact, most of the people who walk in the door are more or less on the lower end of the spectrum. They tend to be coming in the door because they're feeling more pressured, they're having those more internal kind of controls, they're being told by their doctor that they need to do this, right? So part of our idea around creating a need-supportive environment, being able to help people to find a way to find ownership of those behaviors, is we want to transform the way in which they're engaging in the behaviors so that they're less controlled, they're less on that bottom end of the spectrum and more on the autonomous end of the spectrum. And in fact, this has really important implications for outcomes. So we know that when people feel more controlled, right, people don't like to feel controlled. They don't like to feel pressure. So what do you do when you feel pressure? You typically avoid things, right? So unless that pressure is right there in your face trying to get you to do something, you're more likely to kind of avoid the behaviors themselves. So when you have greater value for those behaviors or interest and investment in those behaviors, the more autonomous kind of motivations, you're actually going to be more likely to persist at those behaviors over the long term. And even when it's most difficult, when you're having trouble, which inevitably is going to happen, you're going to be able to see that there's more value in still maintaining those behaviors, and you're going to be more likely to persist when it's most difficult. So In these interventions, we create this need supportive environment through the various kind of components of our intervention that leads to more autonomous self-regulation and more perceived competence. And what we found across 40 years of research, that this also has really positive impacts around not only physical health outcomes, but mental health outcomes. In fact, SDT has been studied in a variety of different settings. So we have looked at adults, children and families, whole community-based settings. We've used different modalities, so everything from individual, group, couples, community-based interventions, M-Health, and health prevention and promotion kind of campaigns. And we've targeted all these different kinds of behaviors, ranging from physical health behaviors like changing physical activity, diet, to mental health, medication use, and addiction. What you see in the literature is just this explosion actually in the last 5 to 10 years, where in 2012 you see that there's evidence for this model that I've just shown you in 184 independent studies. And in 2016, this jumps to 446, so over doubles in 5 years. But what's more important to me, and I think to all of you in this room potentially, is that there is much more work that is not captured in these studies. So there's much more going on in action in the workplace, in community-based interventions, and we're going to hear a lot about that today, and in industry as well. So that's the brief version of SDT, because I have only like 10 minutes to talk. But what I wanted to try to do is help you to understand why SDT really changes the conversation. Why is it something that you should pay attention to in terms of the overall motivation theories or the things that are out there? What's different about this? So I'm just going to give you a handful of examples of how this begins to change the conversation. So first off, let's think about people who we would think of as having no motivation, right? Typically, when we think about folks who have no motivation, folks think, okay, these folks are not ready for change, right? And what happens when you deem people not ready for change? Well, they're simply not engaged in programs, or they're kicked out of the programs, right? So in research studies and randomized clinical trials, there's myriad hoops to get through just to get into the study and then to stay in the study. So any of our empirical research that you see out there for many of our studies is really about some pretty highly motivated people, right? And so the evidence that we're looking at is not really addressing those kinds of folks that really are having trouble with motivation. And in the wild, right, so out in practice, things like surveys around readiness to change are used as weed out tools, right? So either we just don't pay attention to these folks, right, because we don't want to invest money in them, or we don't know how to deal with them. That's the basic kind of approach from many places. With SDT, we actually move directly towards the folks who have no motivation. And in fact, we really want to pay attention to this because, again, just like when you have motivated behavior, there's lots of different reasons for why you're not motivated. And this has important implications for how you intervene with people. So there's 3 basic reasons for why people aren't motivated. The behavior's not important, or there's other things that are more important to them, right? Other priorities. 2, they don't feel like they're competent in being able to carry out the behavior. Or 3, they don't believe if they try, like if I try to lose weight, I'm never going to get that kind of outcome that I'm hoping for. These all have different intervention points that we can begin to think about. So for instance, if the behavior is not important, I could do cartwheels, right, and do all kinds of things, but if the behavior is not important to the person, they're not going to change that behavior. It's possible that by talking with them, they might shift their priorities, they might see different possibilities. One of the things when people say that the behavior's not important, it often is more the second piece, right? They don't feel competent in order to engage in the behavior. And when they don't feel competent, there's an easy kind of way of approaching this. You begin to create a scaffolding for helping them to develop the skills and the requisite kind of needs that they have in order to make the changes. For the third piece, when people don't believe if they try, they're going to achieve the desired outcomes, it's often because they're shooting for outcomes that are actually not really reasonable, right? So I used to work a lot with weight loss programs. They would say, I want to lose 60 pounds in 6 months. not really realistic for most people, right, in that context. And so they're setting themselves up already for disappointments and for difficulties that they're not going to make. How do we help them to rescale that so it feels like something that's more achievable, something that they can move towards? And in fact, with SDT, there's a number of different studies, and Heather's going to talk a little bit about some of the applications in industry about how we actually target folks who have no motivation. So the Smokers' Health Study is a good example. They enrolled folks not who were smokers wanting to quit, but smokers who had no intention of quitting. Right? And what they did was they engaged them in a conversation about how do we, get you to think about your behaviors in context. What they found was that from those people who didn't intend in quitting, a lot of them moved to intention to quit and actually quit their smoking behaviors. We'll see as we talk about, there's a lot of actually health promotion and prevention programs that specifically target this. So Heather will talk about some of this in her own work, but for instance, smokefree.gov, we do a lot of interventions there with people who aren't necessarily ready to quit or intending to quit at that moment, but beginning to start the dialogue about how to develop ways to engage that. So what do the people do typically when we say, oh, we don't have somebody who's motivated? Well, let's kickstart their behavior, right? So let's start by engaging in incentives. What's going to get them to move into behavior? And typically what's happened in industry and other programs as well is that people throw money at them, or they throw different kinds of prizes or things like that. I have a horrific story of even at the University of Rochester, them throwing a lot of money at things that weren't really going to be possible. So when people try to kickstart behavior, it actually backfires, right? So there's a fair number of studies now from the SDT perspective that shows that when you start to try to put these incentives, right, out there for people to engage in, it actually changes the motivation for the behavior itself. So it shifts the focus away from the behavior, which is what you're trying to get them interested in, to the actual kind of incentive. And so you either have to keep reinventing or keep upping the incentives in order to keep them engaged in the behavior, or if those go away, that's when the behavior stops. It's behaviorism 101, right? So what SDT is really focused on, we're not Pollyanna-ish to say that there's not going to be incentives ever, but we want to be looking at how can the incentives be used to help promote the behavior itself, rather than it in itself being the goal, right? So we're looking at how to do that. Treatment engagement. SDT takes a perspective from the beginning that we need to not just focus on initiation. So many products, many kind of interventions are really focused just on this beginning part. How do I kickstart that behavior, right? The issue, though, is that besides what gets them started, the elusive kind of outcome that we really are looking for is what's going to keep them going, right? Because that's going to have the long-term impact. So for starting a model, you need to be thinking from the beginning about maintenance and about how are you setting people up for maintenance. There's a number of different theories like motivational interviewing that's really focused on that initiation part. And I like motivational interviewing, I'm not knocking it, but they allow themselves to be paired with other interventions that totally hijack what motivational interviewing begins with in terms of principle, right? So they can add other kinds of things that actually can undermine motivation after the initial start. So SDT is really focused on the idea that you need to be thinking about this kind of long-term road from the beginning, and that's when we start with the need satisfaction kind of component, because that's going to be important across the entire span. The other thing, though, the reason why this coherence is important is, and thinking about initiation and maintenance, is how you support those needs or the kind of functions are quite different in the initiation phase than in the maintenance phase. So the needs are the same, but the target or the focus is a little bit different. So in initiation, as an example, when you're doing weight loss, you're really trying to understand the person's motivation at the beginning. You're trying to create a plan of action. You're allowing them to help get into the behavior. Whereas in the maintenance part, you're really revisiting other kinds of things around personal skill development that builds on what you've already built on initially, We're looking at for how to continue this in terms of social support over the long term. And we're also looking at kind of bigger or broader picture things like, how does this change my self-concept? How do I enhance that self-concept to be more coherent? And how do I manage life stressors that are inevitably going to cause challenges down the road that might derail this behavior change? Again, I said before about the skills-based competence building focus for folks, and whereas we focused on these 3 basic needs. And why that becomes important, I'll just give you an example, is that in SDT, we're not just focused on content. So we're not just focused on the how to do something, right? We're focused on the process. It's like, in what way are you actually delivering this intervention? So it's really different for me to give you a prescribed set of goals, to tell you what your outcome should be, to give you a set kind of pathway for that, than it is for us to like take a look at where you're at, create choice around how you go about first defining the goals that you want to engage in, how you want to go about defining those goals. So like, you can get to exercising a lot of minutes in lots of different ways, right? If I'm telling you walking and that's not going to work for you, you're immediately shutting down the conversation, right? So it's collaborative, it's self-defined, we're defining an optimal challenge here, and that's really about supporting autonomy, but also really supporting relatedness needs, okay? So beyond just how do I do the mechanics of the behavior change? What is it that I allow the other person to do in terms of the participatory piece of the process, right? To get that investment over the long term. I'll say something about the acceptable outcomes that we take a look at. I think that this is, these are great, right? So we look at things like objective metrics, like how many minutes a person has, logged that week, whether they've had sedentary time or how much of that sedentary time. We look at changes in functioning, changes in well-being indices, as well as cost effectiveness and reach. But I think that one of the things that SDT has really started to change that conversation about is we need to look at more personally meaningful outcomes. Because for a fair number of people, they're never going to get to those outcomes that we deem as acceptable. So the 175 minutes of physical activity, there's a whole lot of people who are never going to get there per week. And maybe they don't even want to get there. But their meaningful change for them, right, is significant and will have an impact on whether or not they continue that over the long term, right? So we need to look at what are those individual goals, what are those individual outcomes like quality of life and other kinds of things like that. They're going to help them to stay engaged. We also need to consider the fact that not changing some or all the behaviors is an option, right? So you can go about changing your nutrition habits or trying to lose weight in a variety of ways. If I continue to push an agenda that's my agenda about how I want you to do that, guess what's going to happen? This. Everybody has their own reactive teenager in themselves, right? So if you tell me what I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to do it, right? I got my own attitude. So we all have that in us. We're going to see a lot more reactance, and we see a lot of studies in which this actually happens. One of the other things we want to be doing is paying attention to how to broaden these outcomes too, to look at things like, well, what else is happening? So when people are not engaged, why is that, right? So here's an example from an intervention that I did with weight loss for the Healthy Living Center. And what we looked at was, when are people dropping out and why are they dropping out, right? And what we find is that it wasn't for the reasons of the fact that they weren't motivated to change their behavior. In fact, they wanted to change their behavior, but their life bucket was too full, right? And so they had no room in that life bucket to be adding any more kind of things to it. So one of the things we were looking at is, how do we do things like reduce their stress, assess their stress at the beginning, and begin to intervene around that so that they have some more room to be able to change some of those other behaviors. I am ending just a second. So in conclusion, this is just a smattering of some of the things that we talk about and why SDT can maybe help to change some of the ways that we think about designing our interventions. As Dustin mentioned, I just recently published a book, and in the book, I provide a much more detailed version of like why motivation matters, what are the important kind of components around that. SDT theory basics in lay terms, right? So I don't write this for academics, and I did that on purpose because sometimes I get too flowery with language in academia. I talk about the basic psychological needs as well as the social context that will help you to kind of create that, not only in the treatment kind of atmosphere, but outside of that. And then I go over the anatomy of an SDT intervention. So not just what are the things that you would address in a health behavior change kind of model, but the delivery of that, both in individual, group, and M-Health applications. So what are the unique considerations of that? And then I finally contrast it to other approaches, particularly ones that are health theories out there that might influence some of your other interventions. I don't have time for this, but if you all are interested, I'd be happy to talk with some of the work that I have done in applying these things to community-based interventions as well as wellness programs, so we can see me afterwards. And if you want to check out the book, it's available on Amazon, or if you're interested in learning more about some of the work that I've done or continue to do, please check out my website, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Or two. There is a mic if you're comfortable, or just raise your hand. And you want to pick? Do you want to hang out at the podium for a moment for questions? So that will help you project.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, you pick.
Go ahead.
You can talk about the implication of SDT in health with elements in game design, because it's a very fundamental theory in game design. It literally solves a lot of the problem you mentioned, like lack of engagement, they're not motivated to change, but if you get some gamified and like rewards, and it works for both children and adults, and now it's becoming very implemented in all industries, but it's going very slowly out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually a book by Rich Ryan and Scott Rigby. Jeez. I know Scott very well too. That's, my mind is blanking. Scott Rigby, that's talking about the SDT applications for gamification. One of the, I'll say two things about some of the challenges I think about how motivation is applied within gamification that become problematic. One is that people set up competitions, right? And the competitions, inevitably, the way they set them up, there's winners and losers. And if you have, many of you may have be, competitive, enjoy that kind of thing, but you may also be on the winning side more often than not. For many people who are making health behavior changes, they already are feeling not so successful, right? And so setting them up into a competition doesn't always work, because for many of those folks, they're going to end up on the losing side of things. And that becomes a way in which they disengage, they become discouraged, it becomes really difficult for them, and you basically have just lost them. When you can engage people around not just a simple like win or lose competition, but rather doing things that help to give self-relevant feedback about improvement, about how they're doing relative to how they did before, right? You can still have competitions, but they can be based not so much on a shame-based kind of competition, but other ways in which you can actually enhance their sense of participation and their excitement about continuing to do that. The other piece is that with rewards, right? Many of the rewards that are set up for gamification are things like stars or things like that lose their interest. Like, people lose their interest. So even though you might have like a really fun game that starts for a while, people will end up, and this has happened with a lot of these very popular games, is that people end up going, okay, this no longer is enticing to me anymore. You can't up the ante anymore about what you're going to get from it. So this is where we look for things like changing the way people engage around challenge, right? How do we set up ways for them to get some more of that feedback so that they can improve their skills or, re-engage in some kind of behavior change in a way that helps to feed back into the behavior itself, rather than the star or the money or the whatever it is. It's probably, thanks.
And again, we'll have time for more questions at the end in a panel style. I would love to introduce our next speaker, another person whose work I've admired for many years, and I have been lucky enough to have her on board as part of the team at MadPow. as a director for behavior change design. Previously to coming on board to MadPow, Amy Bucher has worked at Johnson & Johnson and CVS, bringing her knowledge of behavior change, motivational psychology to a variety of digital interventions and products. She also has a great blog and an amazing Twitter feed, so find her there. Please welcome Amy Bucher.
Thank you. I have to find my slides now. There we go. All right. So Jen's talk, I think, teed me up really nicely. I want to talk today specifically about how to design to support the fundamental need of competence. As Dustin alluded to, a lot of my career has focused on technology-mediated interventions, so either digital interventions or you'll see other examples with other technologies such as telephonic technology. So a lot of focus there. And this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, easy three-step recipe for supporting user competence with your interventions. It's not quite that easy, but the first being identifying the gaps in your user's ability and figuring out how to address them. And I will give you lots of examples of all of these, but two being structuring the goals that you provide somebody so that people can accomplish them step by step. Jen alluded to the fact that oftentimes people have these goals that they're large, they're distant in time. They may be something like losing a significant amount of weight by a future point. And if we don't help break those down into more meaningful steps, it can be very difficult for people to feel focused on those and to feel like their competence is supported as they work toward them. And then third, providing meaningful feedback at each step along the way. So I'll start with the ability gap. And a definition of ability that I really like is that ability is quite simply a function of your scarcest resource. So if you think about that, what does that mean? Here are some of the things that can limit ability. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but if you don't have the time, if you don't know how to do something, if you lack the skill set, if you can't concentrate, if you're distracted, you're in an environment where you simply can't put the focus in, if you don't have the confidence, the tools, the money, all of these things will limit your competence. And if you think about designing for health behavior change, I think it's pretty easy to see where these may actually be sticking points or barriers for people. So if you can, your challenge is to try to design to fill that gap, whether it's thinking about a different way to achieve an objective that doesn't require equipment or doesn't require money, or some of these examples. Two of these come out of the behavioral economics school of intervention. So you may have read the book Nudge. That's the most popular and well-known application of behavioral economics. But in Europe, so you see the person holding the heart. That's my cute way to talk about organ donation. A lot of European nations have now made it so that organ donation is opt-out instead of opt-in. Here in the United States, when you get your driver's license, you have to deliberately check a box that says, yes, I want to be an organ donor. And some percentage of people do that, but a lot of people don't. They may not notice it. It's an extra step. Many European countries now are making that so that in order to not be an organ donor, you have to check the box. And what they've seen is that in those countries, a much higher percentage of people are becoming organ donors. So just by closing that ability gap, making it so that noticing is no longer a particular issue, so that it isn't the effort of the extra pen stroke, they're getting more opt-in. Similarly with 401ks, there's been a lot of research showing that when you make joining a 401k through your employer an opt-out, it automatically happens unless you raise your hand and say no, the rates go way up. And then the third one, the mammogram image there, this is actually a case study that Emmy Solutions did that I thought was really fantastic, where they had automated reminder calls go out to women from their physician's offices when it was time for them to schedule their next mammogram. So there's a little recorded message, hey, it's time for you to come back in. But at the end, it was press 1 to be connected to the scheduling office at your doctor. And they found that when they made it easy, when you no longer had to go look up the phone number, hang up the phone, pick it up again, and call, many more women actually schedule that appointment. So that's another way that you could close the ability gap. Don't make them look up the phone number. Don't make them make a separate call. Another thing you can do is provide just-in-time help. Clippy is an example that I think we maybe all want to punch in the face, but that's what it's intended to do, is close an ability gap. Hey, it looks like you're writing a letter. do you need help on where to put the date and how to fill in the address? And then TurboTax is an example I like a lot. I've been doing my taxes through TurboTax for many years now, and I really like how just when I have a question, it seems to anticipate that, and I get the little pop-up that says, oh, it looks like you've bought a house this year. What do you need to know about that? So just-in-time help can also really help close that ability gap. And then another example is this idea of what if. So when you're making a decision about how to adjust your behaviors, you have a goal in mind, you kind of know what you want to achieve, and you're trying to figure out how to get there. It can be really helpful if you have a tool that can tell you, what will happen if I do this? Will this actually move me closer to my goal? So the Excel-looking example there, that's something called the snowball debt spreadsheet, and it's actually what I use to pay off my student loans. I had many of them, as you might imagine. And what you can do is put in all of your debts with their interest rates and their minimum monthly payments, and you say how much money you have available each month to put toward them, and it lets you rearrange them. You know, what happens if I put my extra money on this loan, or I spread it out across these loans? When will I pay these off? And so I was able to use these to figure out the most efficient way to pay down my debt. So, you know, I actually did pay off my student loans, and it felt fantastic. So, yay. And then in health, the other example here is a cardiovascular disease risk calculator. And there are lots of examples of this sort of thing. They usually tend to focus on, you know, small set of modifiable behaviors like smoking, sedentary behavior, your weight, and it will tell you, you know, hey, if you lose 10 pounds, your risk of cardiovascular disease will drop by this amount in this period of time. Task order also matters. With digital, we're often asking people to take multiple steps across an experience. A lot of the digital programs that I've worked on have lengthy questionnaires or self-report measures. And for anything that is time-consuming or draining, like a questionnaire, if you go hard to easy, you can help support people's sense of competence. We all know off the top of our heads what our demographic information is. I don't have to think that hard to tell you my birthday unless I'm really, really distracted or tired. But some of the questions that we ask people require more reflection. And so if you put those first, when people have more energy and more focus, you can help them not have that ability deficit. On the other hand, if it's a learning or growth-oriented task, and I'll show you some examples of those, but where you have to do step A in order to have the skills or ability to do step B, you want to put them in that order, because if you try to go the other way, people won't know what they need to do. So task order does matter, and it's something to think about in terms of ability. Next is setting up your goals so that they have sub-goals or milestones that are clear and easy to achieve. So well-designed goals, you probably all heard of SMART goals. This is just a different variation on it really, but they're very clear and specific. You really want to define the behavior that you expect of a person. Chunked and nested. This means that they're organized in meaningful units. So I will show an example of Duolingo. It's an example I like a lot because I think they've done a wonderful job with this. But it's a language learning program, and when you're learning verb skills, for example, those get chunked and nested together because they make sense together. They are part of a family. They're variable, so you don't want people to get bored. You want to see some progression and growth, well aligned, so they actually get a person to the ultimate goal that you want them to arrive at. And then meaningful and collective. So this is just I love moving my PowerPoint to new laptops that don't have my font. It looked really good on my computer. But you have your starting state and your end state, and I think with design, it's very easy to say what those two things look like, but then really mapping out clearly what the sub-goals along the way are as well. You may have heard of flow. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. I've worked very hard to learn to pronounce that. But Jen referenced this as well. Thank you. Jen referenced this as well, this idea that when you're creating competence supporting experiences for people, you want them to be challenging enough that people are engaged. They do feel this sense of striving and achievement. But if they're too easy, they'll be bored. They'll drop off because there's no reason to stay interested in it. There's this lovely middle place called the flow channel where it's challenging and growth oriented, not so hard that I can't do it and I'm frustrated, not so easy that I'm bored. And so our goal is to achieve that. And then within that, you will see these peaks and valleys. So, you know, maybe I'm working really hard and I am having some failures while also seeing growth. Or maybe this section's a little easier and I can coast a bit. But the key is to always kind of regress back to that mean so that you're getting that sense of optimal challenge. Promised you Duolingo, and here it is. I highly recommend this. I've heard there have been some recent changes to the reward structure of this program that are backfiring. Just a little bit of, user feedback because I do talk about this a lot. But the nice thing that Duolingo does is give you a lot of feedback on your progress, and it gives you that feedback in a couple different ways. So you can see that you actually have icons that color in as you progress through lessons. So you can visually track what you've completed and what's next for you. And then you also gain experience points, and you can compare yourself not only to your past self, but also to your friends. So there's a lot of different ways to get progress feedback here. And it works. They actually commissioned a research study, and they found that 34 hours of using the Duolingo program is equal to 1 university semester of a language. I've done the math on this, and when I took a first-year language course in university, it was over 100 hours of classroom time, not including homework and lab. So that's a really pretty significant effect for structuring your goals this way. Meaningful feedback. So what worked and what could be better? And again, Jen teed this up really nicely too. There will inevitably be failures or falling short of your goal. And so how do we support people in those situations so that they still feel like there is a possibility to try again? Good feedback is timely. You deliver it within a time frame where a person can hopefully make use of it. I suspect that many of us have been in situations where you receive feedback weeks or months down the road and there's no longer any way to do anything about it. That's so frustrating. Try to provide your feedback in a timely manner so that people can make use of it. It's actionable, so not just I didn't like that, but it would have been better if the font were blue. Meaningful. What I just said about the font is a very poor example of meaningful feedback because who cares what color the font is? And at multiple levels, I'll show you examples of what that looks like. Feedback can start out just by baseline monitoring. A lot of times with behavior and behavior change, we don't really have a good sense of our starting point. So thinking about diet and exercise, this is an area where there's been a lot of monitoring. You see wearables, you see trackers, and it's pretty effective just to start off with that baseline, to give people a sense of what their current performance is. So these are just a few studies, but you see twice as much weight loss when someone uses a food diary as when they don't. It gives people this sense of awareness around what they eat that's really critical to get them to start to identify on their own some places to make changes. Calorie diaries, again, 18% of people who are successful kept one versus 8% who are, I'm saying that wrong. People who kept a calorie diary are more likely to be successful. And then pedometers, you see a 27% increase in steps just from wearing it, and again, seeing that baseline. This is an interesting study. This is still a working paper, but I thought this was really cool. This is airline pilots. And apparently there's a way that you can fly the airplane that is fuel conserving. So you monitor your speed and your wind drifts and such in a way that you actually end up using yet less jet fuel. And so these researchers wanted to see, could they encourage pilots to make those sorts of sustainable choices so that they would conserve fuel over the course of their flight. And they tried 4 different conditions. One is just we're going to monitor your fuel use. One was we'll give you feedback on your fuel use. One was personal target, so this was everybody set their own goal about how much fuel they wanted to conserve, and then we're measured against that. And then lastly was charity donation, which was if you met your goals, they would donate a certain amount of money to charity for you. And you can actually see that there was a positive effect in all of the conditions. And what I thought was interesting about it is that baseline monitoring on its own isn't statistically different from these other conditions. It's not statistically different from reward. Just knowing how you're doing in this particular set of behaviors is enough to get people to shift it. Another example, I got home last night and I had one of these, and I was so pissed. So O-Power is one company that does this, but this is becoming more common now. It's an add-on to your utility bills that will give you normative feedback on how your electricity usage is. Normative feedback is a really critical way as well that you can give people feedback. What are other people like you doing? So that's what you're comparing people to. They did a study with Alcott in 2011 where they found that sending people these reports reduced electricity usage by 1.4 to 3.3%. That's pretty significant actually when you think about it in terms of total kilowatt hours, even though the percentage sounds low. And now I'm getting it too. And you see there's the little smiley face that says good, and apparently I'm using 81% more electricity than efficient homes. When I got it last night, I was pissed because it said 14%, and we've been like sweating. We've been trying. Another thing you see a lot in digital programs is badges. I have a lot of feelings about badges. These are all from Foursquare. You check into different physical locations. They've actually changed their business model and their program quite a bit, but this was kind of the first big badge program. And you will get a badge if you keep checking into places along a theme. So if you're a bar hopper, you'll get the martini badge. people do like them. They're, bright and shiny, and it can be fun to collect them, but there are a lot of reasons why they tend to peter out over time. So one of them, I actually have a quote from Scott Rigby, who wrote the fantastic book Glued to Games, but Foursquare had this program with third-party health badges. So they partnered with Health Month and I think with Runkeeper, and you were able to earn these badges by doing fitness activities. However, it was really easy to cheat. And so the quote from Scott here, this is exactly what self-determination theory would predict. People game the system just to get the badge. You focus on the reward and not on the path to get the reward. And so they ended up retiring these badges. This slide, I think, is out of order here, but giving people a goal to aim for can be a really good way as well to help them understand their performance. And so this is an example. If you've read the book Nudge Again, you've seen the fly in the urinal. It's a sticker. It's a sticker that you place in the urinal, and it, as Amazon says here, gives your boys something to aim for. You can buy these online. They sell color-changing ones as well, like with heat, they'll change color or change patterns. Supposedly, I don't know if this is true, and I'm not sure how you do this research study. It using these in urinals makes the floor hospital grade clean underneath. I don't know who did that research, and I don't envy their job, but giving a target. The reason I said I was out of order is to get back to the whole badges and rewards. Starbucks is an example that I think does a very, very nice job with this, and it gets back to what Jen said, where the reward actually feeds the behavior. Starbucks is not a behavior change application per se, but they launched their mobile app, and its goal is to get you to buy more coffee, more Starbucks products. And so what they do is they fill your cup with stars as you spend money at Starbucks, and when your cup is full enough of stars, you can redeem them for more Starbucks product. So it's this lovely self-perpetuating cycle where the reward feeds right back into the behavior. The only thing these stars are good for is shopping at Starbucks. And I pull this data every once in a while. They do press releases about the performance of the app. It's a huge percentage of their transactions and incredibly popular. And in fact, they're now having trouble because the app is so popular that the physical stores sometimes can't keep up with the demand from the pre-orders on the app. So this has been incredibly effective at getting people to do the behaviors they want them to do. Feedback at multiple levels. Video games are a great example of places where self-determination theory has been brought to life. And this is, I'm not a gamer myself, so I never remember the names of the games that I get screenshots from. I'm sorry, but you can see that there's feedback at multiple levels here. You can see where your bullets are actually striking, and you can also see your score changing over time. There's been a little bit of controversy in the field about, are people into video games just because they're so violent? Are children being trained to be violent because of these video games? And one of the things that self-determination theory researchers have done that I've thought is really fascinating is they found that it's actually a lot about this feedback mechanism and less about the content of the game. So this, I do know the name because it's right on here, Glider Classic, super not violent and not very good graphics, but again, it has this feedback at multiple levels. You have to pick up these stars with your paper glider and not get hit by obstacles. And this was actually what they used as the control condition in some of the video game studies, this particular game. And they found they could get people just as hooked on this as on the high quality graphic shoot 'em up games. So it does not seem to be the content of the game so much as the feedback mechanisms that's driving that. So when you're thinking about multiple levels, you've got granular, that's like moment to moment, what am I doing right now? Sustained, so things like streaks, and think about health behavior change. There are a lot of programs now that do streaks. So you've gone and exercised 4 or 5 days in a row. I use Fitbit and I get a little alert when I work out five days in a week. So that's sustained feedback. And then cumulative is over a longer period of time. So think about weight loss. It's really important with something like that because if I'm trying to lose weight and today was somebody's birthday and I slipped up and had a huge piece of cake, it's important to remind me that, you know what, you've still made a lot of progress. You're still down 10 pounds. You're still partway there. Another video game example that I like, but you can see this is Rock Band, and you can see the immediate feedback from the strokes that you play on your instruments and then the longer term feedback from your streaks and your points that you accumulate. And then a health example, Amy Cueva mentioned this yesterday. This is from the Imagine Care app that MadPow worked on, but multiple levels of feedback here as well. So you can see your weight each day as you weigh in and your other biometrics as you're measuring them in the moment, but then you also can see your performance over time. So you can track those changes over time. So just to give you a quick summary, some best practices for competence support. These actually align back with my 3 rules at the beginning. The first, identifying gaps in ability and offering ways to narrow them. The next 2 are around those goals and goal structuring, goal laddering. So specifying what the end goal is, and then your milestones along the way, and then sequencing those milestones in a way that a person is growing. And then finally, for feedback, offering that timely, specific, and actionable feedback at multiple levels of detail, and acknowledging both success, but then supporting improvement if people don't do well, which they often won't. So, thank you. Yeah, please.
So we're talking about behavior change. Is there a point where behavior actually changes? Is there an inflection point, and can you describe that, or is this a conversation that takes place for the rest of someone's life where they're continuously coached?
I haven't thought about it in terms of an inflection point, but I do know that people's needs for need support change over the course of their behavior change journey. And Jen mentioned this a little bit as well, but with competence, as a rule of thumb, I think people tend to need more frequent feedback earlier in their behavior change journey. They're still learning oftentimes. They're probably less certain about their self-efficacy, their ability to make that change. And so when I approach these projects, I'm typically looking to give more competence support to that early stage user. And then over time, as a person becomes more practiced, the other thing you sometimes see is feedback fatigue. So if you've been doing this for a long time, I don't really care anymore if you're going to congratulate me every day that I meet my step goal or every time I lose a pound. So I've found that you can wane a little bit on your competence, your feedback mechanisms at that point. I'm not sure about the inflection point. That's an interesting way to think about it, and I'd like to think about it more.
One more?
Yep.
I'm curious about, I mean, that's really interesting. I'm curious about one specific thing you mentioned with the diaries and tracking.
Yes.
Your thoughts on the correlation with causation. Somebody who's more motivated to track.
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear it, is about with food tracking and diaries, what about correlation versus causation? And I think that is a great question also because there has been really, I hesitate to present that sometimes because there's been really mixed recent research about the efficacy of tracking on weight loss specifically, but weight loss happens because you move more and eat less. So, I think it's an interesting possibility that more conscientious people who are perhaps doing the weight loss behaviors better are also doing these ancillary behaviors like tracking. I suspect that the effect of tracking is less than studies like that make it appear because there is some of that correlation going on, but I also suspect that there is a real effect. So I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think it does orient people to what they're doing and help them make changes, but I also think there's a certain type of person who's more likely to do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, another person who's influenced my thinking greatly. I'd like to introduce, I'm going to bring your slides up too. No. We didn't have the slides up, and I want to make sure those slides are up. So I'd like to introduce Heather Patrick. Sorry about the timing of that. Slides, I get distracted by the slides. Heather Patrick, she is VP of Behavioral Science at Carrot Sense, formerly Senior Director of Applied Behavior Change Science at Live Healthier and Involve. She's also done a wealth of amazing research around motivation and behavior change, which you can find on selfdeterminationtheory.org, and has done some great work also with Jennifer on NCI and smokefree.gov applications. So please welcome Heather Patrick. Thank you.
So many buttons, and I always find that anytime I'm going to talk about technology, there's usually some kind of technology snafu, so we'll see how things go this morning. Since my slides weren't loaded earlier, I'm going to call that as my technology snafu, so it should be smooth sailing from here on out. Good morning. So it's still morning. I'm so excited to be here and to have an opportunity to talk with you about something that I am really interested in and I think has not gotten enough attention in the scientific literature and also in application, and that is what do we do with people who are not motivated for change? What do we do with this guy? Because the reality is that once we get out into the wild with free-range humans, we find that we don't always have people who are raring to go around behavior change. And Jen talked about some of the reasons why people might not be motivated for change, and I'm going to dig a little deeper in that. But what do we do with these folks? Well, we've got some options. So the treatment of people who are not motivated for change is often let's ignore them and maybe they will go away. And in fact, in the clinical trial setting, we often encourage them to go away if they're not ready at a certain level. Another thing that we often do is assume, well, if somebody is not motivated to change, it must be because they just don't know any better, so I need to educate them. And if I just give people enough information, that will be the catalyst for them to make transformative change in their lives. And I think that there probably was a time in our collective history in public health where education was necessary. I'm not sure that that's where we are today in 2017. If I walk outside here, just outside the hotel room, outside the hotel door, and I see somebody who's smoking cigarettes, and I ask them, do you know that smoking is bad for your health? Not a single one of them is going to say, I had no idea. And likewise, if I walk across the street and go through the tables at Cheesecake Factory, as somebody is taking a bite of that cheesecake and say, hey, did you know that that might not be the healthiest choice? Nobody's going to be surprised to know that. So I think we can probably all safely agree that public health has done a great service of educating people, and nobody's going to be surprised by most of these facts. Now, there are, of course, some differences. When we're talking about patient populations where somebody is newly diagnosed with a condition and they don't know what they need to do to manage that condition, of course, there's information that needs to be provided. But if you've ever worked in that space, you know that just providing people with information is not often all that you need to do to support them in managing that condition. So we can also cheer them on. You just need a pep talk, and then you'll be ready to go. I don't know about any of the rest of you, but if you've ever had the experience of being discouraged with making some kind of change, or if you've been on the fence about something, somebody going, go you, is probably really not going to do you a whole lot of good. And yet that's an approach that's often used. We can also nudge them in the right direction. I know there's a lot of popular press, and I don't wish to step on any landmines, but the use of that word is one that makes me a little bit agitated because the assumption when you're trying to nudge someone is that you know what's best for that person. And very rarely on an individual basis are you going to be the expert about somebody else's life and what is the best outcome for them. And then another one of my personal favorites is maybe we just need to motivate them. And I don't even know at this point what that really means, because that suggests kind of inflicting something on people in a way that may or may not be welcome. So I think by approaching lack of motivation in any of those ways, we've missed an opportunity, and we don't really understand what the problem of amotivation is. By ignoring people who are not motivated, we've developed an evidence base that doesn't include them. And so we know very little scientifically about what's going on for people who are not motivated, and we know even less about how we can start to make that shift into helping them make positive change, either for something that we think is important for them, or more importantly, that they might make change in areas that are important to them that then kind of spill over into these other areas. We also know relatively little about how to work with these individuals, and we just haven't taken the time to do so. By attempting to educate or by focusing on dumping buckets of knowledge on people, we've assumed people's ignorance where it probably doesn't exist. And I'm sure you've all had the experience of being in a meeting or on a conference call or in some other setting where somebody is talking to you about something you already know about, and there are few things that are more maddening and more insulting than that. And so I think that this is something else that's important. And going back to something that I said earlier, I think when we're taking the position of I need to educate you or this program needs to educate you, we're also assuming an expert role when we are not the expert on other people's lives and what they're facing on a day-to-day basis. By attempting to nudge, by cheering people on, or by finding other ways to motivate people, we've really missed an opportunity to understand what's in the way between them and this positive behavior change that we think is best for them to enact. And we've assumed that what we know is best. Now, there are some notable exceptions that we're starting to see in the literature where various theories and perspectives have started to take on a little bit more nuance around understanding what is it that's behind people not being motivated. So stages of change, the trans-theoretical model has a long history of at least acknowledging the potential for amotivation, and they called this pre-contemplation. Now, I will say that that was often used as a tool for weeding people out of programs and interventions, but some of the more recent conceptualizations within the trans-theoretical model has made this very important distinction amongst those who are in pre-contemplation between those who are in the I can't camp and those who are in the I won't camp. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a moment. Motivational interviewing, which Jen mentioned in her presentation, also directly acknowledges ambivalence. It acknowledges that people might be on the fence about changing, and that's a flavor of not being motivated for change, and that's acknowledged as a very normal part of the change process. And it's taken the approach of supporting clinicians in developing skills to work with rather than to argue against that ambivalence. So that rather than trying to convince a client aggressively, it's about developing a set of skills to work with a client where they are in that ambivalence. And of course, there's self-determination theory. Now, one of the things that I think is particularly interesting to me about self-determination theory, and I've been in that world for my entire career, is that while amotivation is something that exists on the motivational continuum, in the SDT literature, we have also not really paid that much attention to it. In fact, amotivation is often swept under the rug as, oh, that's just this thing that happens when people are depressed or they have low mood. And we've not had an opportunity to really dig in and study a little bit more rigorously what's going on there. However, I think one of the things that SDT does really well is that it provides a clinical approach that includes supporting client choice, including the choice not to engage in behavior change, providing unconditional positive regard, so the relationship between the program, the digitally delivered solution, the practitioner, and the user, the client, the patient, is one in which we're here with you no matter what's happening for you. I'm not here for you just to make the choice to do the thing I think you should do. I'm here for you no matter what. And that unconditional positive regard, I think, is particularly important when people are wrestling with ambivalence or other forms of amotivation. And SDT also promotes this idea of encouraging practitioners to kind of check their agenda at the door. This is not about the practitioner. This is not about the program. The program does not know best. The user, the client, the patient does. So let's look a little bit deeper here. I think people who are in the I won't camp are a little bit more complex, and there are at least a couple of reasons why somebody might be in the I won't place. One reason they might be in the I won't place is this. It's you can't tell me what to do. And I think particularly when we're thinking about health behavior and health behavior change, there are a lot of policies that are pushing that agenda. There is social shaming around people who do or do not engage in those behaviors. And so there's a lot of reactivity. So there was a piece that came out in the Washington Post last week about the fact that in the case of tobacco use, we've seen this great change in tobacco use, but it's very disproportionately been seen in higher education and higher income populations. And in lower income populations in particular, smoking rates still tend to be quite high. And I actually had the opportunity to take a look at what Reddit was saying about that particular article, which is such a fascinating cross-section of people's responses to the world. And one of the things that I was seeing in the Reddit feed on that article was a lot of reactance, where people were describing this feeling that these ideas about health, about not smoking, like this comes from the nanny state. This is all about people telling me what to do, and you're taking away my personal rights to do what I want to do. I'm an adult. I can do whatever I want. And so I think that's worth paying attention to. So that's one part of the I won't camp. I think there's also a part of the I won't camp that is also very filled with despair. I think that with a lot of behavior changes, when we see people, when they touch our programs that we've designed so elegantly, this is not their first rodeo. They have been there and done that many times before. So this brings us into the I can't collection of people. And I think, as Jen mentioned, these are the folks where we can start to think in terms of how do we help them to develop the skills. And skills and abilities are part of this, and I think that fostering competence, to tag on to some of what Amy was saying, is also a big part of addressing the I can't. But I think I can't also is something that happens for people when their buckets are full. And when we are thinking in terms of health equity, and we're thinking about the populations who aren't engaging in positive health behavior change, they have a lot going on in their lives. And so the I can't in that case isn't I don't have the ability. The I can't is there's too much else that's going on in my life right now to be able to put the time, the energy, the financial the psychological resources into making this change. And finally, not finally, actually, there's one more. Next is this issue of ambivalence. And I think there's really a great opportunity for us to understand why people are on the fence. When we're talking about motivation and behavior change, people are doing what they're doing right now because it serves a purpose. I know as a health psychologist and a public health person, it's really hard to imagine that. But it's true. People smoke for a reason. It's serving a purpose in their lives. People are not physically active for a reason. And so when we're asking people to make change, we have to acknowledge that we're asking them to disrupt something that's working really well for them right now. And finally, I think another thing that we've missed here is this issue of relatedness. So relatedness is the third of the psychological needs. It's the one that has gotten the least attention, even in the relationships literature, which is how I cut my teeth in SDT. And here's what I think is going on. I think because there is so much social stigma around weight, around smoking, many of us live in areas where it's normative to be physically active, where you've got access to lots of fruits and vegetables. That creates social norms, and social norms are often seen as this very positive, powerful thing, but they're also a way that the people who aren't engaging in those behaviors feel isolated and disconnected, and they feel like nobody really gets where they're coming from. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later. So this brings me to a big what if. And I'm going to talk specifically about tobacco cessation because that happens to be the world I'm working in right now. I've also worked in other health behavior spaces. But what if we developed a smoking cessation program that didn't start with quit? Now, having come from the public health world, having worked in the US federal government at the National Cancer Institute, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. The most important thing you can do for your health is quit smoking. And if I'm talking to a smoker, I cannot think of a more pretentious, misunderstood thing to say. Because again, I've yet to talk to a smoker who thinks that they're making good choices for themselves. And they've heard it in the surroundings. They've heard it in the culture that quitting is important. They have the voice in their head that tells them they should do it, and they aren't for a reason. So what if we didn't start with quit? So I'm working right now for a company called Carrot Sense, and we're developing a product called Pivot. And we don't start with quit. This is a year-long program. It incorporates a collection of digital tools, including a digital sensor, which I'll talk about in a moment, a year-long app-delivered behavioral intervention based on the latest and greatest in behavior change science, and we also include health coaching. I'm going to talk specifically about the first phase of our program, which is called Explore. Explore lasts for 9 days. The focus of Explore, at no point in those 9 days do we say anything at all about choosing a quit date, about making a quit plan, about quitting at all. Explore is exclusively for the user, and it's for the user to get information not about smoking in general, though we do provide some of that. It's really about the user getting information about himself or herself. We have a mobile breath sensor. That breath sensor is a small device, which you can see one of our product managers modeling here. It's a small device. It buzzes every hour on the hour, and they have an opportunity to blow into it. It gives them a reading of the carbon monoxide levels in their exhaled breath. We let people know what carbon monoxide is. It is one of the chemicals that they take in when they're smoking cigarettes, and so this is a reasonable proxy of the levels of toxicity that they have in their bodies from smoking cigarettes. Why does this matter? Well, as with most health behavior changes, when it comes to quitting smoking, what we're asking people to do is to do something really hard and really uncomfortable right now for something that may or may not happen to them 30 years in the future. And I don't know about you, but the relevance of something that's happening 30 days and sometimes 30 minutes in the future is not that great for me. And that's even with things that are fairly well predictable, like if I wait 30 minutes, I'm going to get stuck in terrible DC traffic. But I have this other thing that I need to do, right? So I think one of the things that's particularly powerful about the breath sensor is that it brings into the here and now. This is information about what's happening to your body right now. We give them the meaningful feedback. On their personal dashboard, they can see their daily fluctuations in carbon monoxide. We have a little guy that fills up over the course of the day so they can see kind of how that adds up over time. And because this is something that they can also link with logging smoking, they can see how those carbon monoxide levels shift as a function of their smoking. So when you wake up first thing in the morning and you haven't had a cigarette for a while, you see that your CO levels are really low. And then when you check again at 11 o'clock this morning after you've had your smoke break at work, you can see that it's much higher. So Explore lasts for 9 days. It's intentionally designed to make information relevant to people, not something that's far removed. And it's really an opportunity for users to explore how smoking fits in with their lives, including having an opportunity to reflect on what do you like about smoking? What are your reasons for smoking? We entertain that question. And that's something that most of our users have never had the experience of. Nobody asks them, what do you like about smoking? What people ask them is, why don't you quit that nasty habit? And so this allows them to see what is it that's keeping them there. They also have an opportunity to think about, if you were to quit, why would that be important to you? What are your reasons? Because your reasons are really what matter. My reasons, not so much. We also provide them information about the more proximal ways that smoking costs them in terms of finances and also in terms of time. So we know how much users are smoking. We've also asked them to input how much they pay for a pack of cigarettes. So my company is based in California. I live on the East Coast in DC. These are places where a pack of cigarettes costs anywhere between $8 and $10. The average smoker smokes a pack a day. So $8 to $10 a day multiplies out really quickly, and we provide them with that information. And for a lot of users, one of the things that we're hearing is, first, having this carbon monoxide sensor has been so eye-opening. I had no idea. And then, oh my gosh, I didn't know that I was spending that much money each week, each month, each year on this product. We also introduce a health coach, and our health coaches are trained in SDT principles as well as principles of motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy. And we framed the Explore part of the health coaching entirely around this idea of we're not focused on quitting. So this is a sample interaction between a real coach and a real user. Hi, I'm your coach. I'm looking forward to working with you as you go through Pivot. What's one thing you think people don't get about you and smoking? And we start with questions like that on purpose because we see that what's happening for most of our users is a lack of relatedness. They feel like nobody understands what it's like for them to smoke or why smoking matters to them. Here the user acknowledges this social shame that he's experiencing. Most people consider this obnoxious and it's a deal killer for dating. If you knew me, it's totally incongruous with my behavior. It doesn't match who I am. Also, I really love when our users use big words like incongruous. That doesn't happen all the time, but I was like, wow, that's actually from a user. The other way that we've asked the question is what's one thing you want me as your coach to know about you and smoking? Again, starting to build rapport. This is an entirely text message delivered coaching program. We want to be sure that users know we believe in you. And that's in fact one of the key mottos of our company, is that we believe in smokers. And it's really important to us to convey that to our users, because in so many other areas of their lives, not only around smoking, but elsewhere, nobody's really asking them what's important to them or what's standing out to them. So this person goes right for the jugular. I was wondering if you ever smoked or someone like a parent smoked. This is a user who wants some relatedness. This is a user who wants to know, do you know what this is like? Is this personally meaningful to you? And this is a really challenging issue, right? Because as a coach, you of course want to engage with the user in a compassionate way. You want to form that bridge with them. And that question is a landmine in the smoking world. Like, there is no good way that you can answer that question directly that it won't make the entire conversation about the coach. And what I really love about this interaction is that Jen did such a great job of, rather than making it about her, flipping it back to the user. Sounds like what you're really wondering is if I can relate to what you're going through. And the conversation flowed from there, being about the user and not being about the coach. We also ask users how smoking makes them feel. When we ask users why they smoke, they tell us their reasons. This user had indicated that their main reasons to smoke was that smoking was the way they unwind. It's their me time. So the coach asks, how does smoking make you feel during your me time? And you see here this barrage of that inner judge being unleashed for this user. Shameful, powerless, unclean, willing to accept the thought of illness and disease, embarrassed. That's heavy. This is like the second interaction that this coach has had via text message with this user. That's deep, it's heavy. It speaks to the guilt that this person is carrying around about this behavior that they know is bad for them and that they can't stop. So Laura did a really great thing here as a coach, and she asked, she paused and she thought, okay, we could go down this negative rabbit hole, but there's another way to talk about this with the user. What makes you feel strong and in control? And all of a sudden, the entire tone of the conversation changes, because this has forced the user we're not talking about quitting here. We're talking about what makes you feel strong and in control. And here she acknowledges, I feel strong when I'm not basing my time on when I'm going to smoke or when I'm going to buy cigarettes. And then there's an opportunity to allow the user to create for themselves a vision of their smoke-free life without ever asking them to quit. What would your life be like if you didn't have to work around cigarettes? And the user is able to explore this for themselves with no pressure, no deadline, no expectation on the part of the coach. This is in the first 9 days of a program where we are not talking about quitting at all. So, what have we learned so far with this program? This is new. We're building this. We've run about 35 users through this first part just to see what happens. And here's what we see. First, we see positive improvements in attitudes toward quitting smoking. We see that they are feeling that it'll be a little bit less difficult for them to quit if they were to decide to. We see that they're feeling that they're likely to be a little bit more successful. And although it's not currently statistically significant because N of 35, we're also seeing positive improvements in their readiness to quit smoking. And for some of our users, this has been really marked, where they come in and they're at like a 3 or 4 on a 1 to 10 scale, and they're at like a 7 or an 8 or a 9 after 9 days of not talking about quitting. 80% of our users reported that they, on their own, decreased how many cigarettes per day they were smoking over the course of their participation. The most common methods that they used were smoking fewer cigarettes and increasing their time between cigarettes, and these were things that they were doing on their own, again, in the absence of us even talking about quitting. So that's where we are right now. We're on a mission, and our mission is about engaging people even when they aren't ready yet to quit. And I'm super excited to get to be part of this work and to start to understand a little bit more about what it's like when people don't want to change.
Time for a question or two.
Can you say, was there a reason why you chose 9 days for the Explorer period?
No. We wanted to have a little bit of a lead in, and I think one of the things that's really tricky about trying to have a program that speaks to people who are not yet ready to change is that we are not excluding people who are ready to change. And so we wanted to try to strike a middle ground of there being a little bit of a lead in there, but not so much of a lead in that if somebody comes in and they're really ready to go, that we're being the gatekeepers and keeping them from that change. So in the next phase after Explore, that's very much user driven. So after Explore, we have Build. That's very user driven. A user can blow through Build, which includes building a quit plan if they want to and if they're ready to. They can do that in a day if they want to. Or if they're not ready, they have 4 weeks worth of activities that they can take a look at and play around with. We've got stuff that addresses motivation and ambivalence. We've got stuff that's like, if you're not feeling very confident, here are some things. We allow them to do some daily challenges where they can kind of like go out into the real world and try things out. They can do practice quits. So that's where we have a little bit more flexibility to allow for users to have more time. But we were really trying to strike a balance of how do we get people this information in a meaningful and compelling way without keeping them from quitting if they're ready to for those folks. Yes.
I was wondering if what you think about the role of identity in kind of motivation, behavior change, and particularly like the process of like letting go of maybe your identity as a smoker or non-smoker or other areas.
Yeah. So we've actually been, because we are literally building this like as we speak, we've been talking a lot about this, particularly when people are coming into their quit day and what we want to do to kind of acknowledge that this is a transition point for you. And obviously, like when somebody chooses a quit day, it's not like, aha, and this day has arrived and you are magically no longer a smoker. But I think that identity is really important, and that's certainly something that that SDT speaks to as well, is we connect to our behaviors in very meaningful ways. And I thought it was interesting in that one user story where the user was like, smoking is actually not at all consistent with who I am. So in this interesting way, he had kind of these dual identities as a smoker and as this person who's really principled and has these high standards that he holds himself to, and this thing that disconnects. So I think that there's definitely something important about identity and something important about acknowledging that when somebody's making a change, we hear this all the time in the weight loss literature, right? Like where somebody loses a dramatic amount of weight and they continue to see themselves as the overweight person that they used to be. And I think we've not done quite as well in the practice space around how do we help people transition in those identities and shift how they see themselves as a healthy person. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with that is build in some of these visioning exercises that allow people to start to imagine what their life might be like when they're not a smoker. It's a step. It's our best first guess, but I think there will be more to come. All right. Thank you so much.
I'd like to bring up our final speaker for the sessions. We'll have some time for open panel discussion after. But I'd like to introduce the man known as Coach Steve-O. Steve-O is CEO and founder of Habitry, where he helps coaches be better, more effective coaches. Hey! And he also has a great podcast as well, where I think everyone on today's session has been there. There's tons of great engaging conversations around people who help other people be better at things and how they got better at things on their own. So I would like to welcome up to the podium Coach Steve-O. Thank you.
Thanks. I gotta get my deck started. Before I do, I just want to make sure that I talk about the right thing for you guys. How many of you had never heard of basic psychological needs before you came into this room, that term? Everyone had? Cool. And how many people here work with coaches and health coaches? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people. Great. Let me just get my deck up. Sorry. Dustin asked me to talk about the intervention that we designed for working with health coaches. I'm just going to not use that. It's not working. And we call that the intervention that we designed the essentials. We just call it essentials because we think it's, when it comes to being a coach, when it comes to being a health coach specifically, I think it's easy to get lost in a lot of the content that has to be delivered, but then at the end of the day, the job of being a coach is exceedingly small, and when you is exceedingly focused. And when you start to actually use a lot of the fantastic work that's come out of self-determination theory, that field gets even smaller. So I'm going to tell you the story of how we accidentally ended up in this job. We started out, me as a health coach, and the first population that I ever worked with, it was a very unique context. It was people for whom motivation is not a problem. And that was when I was an officer candidate in the United States Marine Corps. Working with Marine Corps officer candidates to help them lose weight or pass a physical fitness test is pretty easy. You just tell them what to do, and then they do it. Really easy. But then when that didn't work out, and this is, you can probably take a guess at why being a Marine officer didn't work out for me. For contrast, this guy became a Special Forces officer and a Fulbright scholar. This is more of a fit for him. But when I went out into the civilian world and encountered my first clients as a personal trainer, they had a little bit different experience. This was their experience at the gym, and this is what they wanted to think about. And my second paying client, second, was 80 years old, and she walked up to me at the gym where I was standing around hoping that someone would ask me if I was a personal trainer, and she did, and she said, "My doctor says I need to lose 15 pounds, which is classic interjected motivation. And I did not know that at the time because I was just some guy. And I started telling her all the great things that she was going to get to do. And she glazed over and she said, "Yeah, I know I'm supposed to do all that stuff. That's not why I want to pay you money. I know what to do. I can't make myself do it." And that's when I realized that in my training as a personal trainer and as a coach, no one had ever talked to me about that. It seemed like it was an important issue because it was what everyone was giving me money to fix, but I didn't have any tools to do anything about it. So I went to graduate school for health psychology and found out about this theory that had been around for 40 years that explained the answer to that question about how do you help people who know what to do but can't make themselves do it, and then founded a company to help do that. The company is called Habitry, and our mission is to help the most people help the most people. The first attempt we had at that was actually an app that saw very good results for all the coaches that wanted an app, which was an exceedingly small number. But this weird thing happened. We had this elaborate onboarding program to teach coaches how to best use the app, and basically was teaching them supporting basic psychological needs. And people would show up for our onboarding courses with no intention ever of using the app. They didn't want the app, which is, I guess, like finding out that you've designed a Ferrari and everyone just wants the owner's manual. Like, that's what it felt like. So not enough people used the app because it was just, frankly, the wrong tool. But right around the time when we were like, oh no, what do we do? We're almost out of money. Someone came knocking and asked if we could teach their community of coaches how to support basic psychological needs and do all that magic motivation science stuff that we had been doing with the coaches on the app. And that company is called Lift the Bar. And we were very excited. It's a community of personal trainers in the UK. But at this point, we had worked with maybe 100, 150 coaches on the app. But this community was 1,000 coaches with total tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of clients, impacting millions of hours of actual training time. And we got pretty scared about that, the bigness of that problem. So we decided to think about this smaller. What's the job of a coach? What is the one thing a coach needs to be able to do? We could teach them that, and maybe we wouldn't screw things up too badly. So we had been teaching coaches that a metaphor for supporting basic psychological needs, and that is, we call it the hot tub. Supporting basic psychological needs feels like being in a hot tub party. It's everyone's excited and motivated, and it's a fun place to be. So we wanted to teach coaches how to make their own hot tub parties and keep people excited and engaged and motivated to keep hanging out in the hot tub until their goals were met. But there was a problem with that, which is from a great quote from someone else on the panel. I found that picture of you today. Supporting basic psychological needs is a mindset, not a checklist. And this was a pretty big problem for a lot of people who are just like, just tell me what to do, I'll check the things off the list, and then I'll be magically supporting basic psychological needs. But it's a little more complicated than that. We thought we could just send 1,000 copies of Jen's book to the UK, but that might maybe not have been the most effective, since these are people who wanted to engage with something in very small doses. So we ran into this problem. How do we create an autonomy supportive climate to teach autonomy support? How do we create a competence supporting climate to teach competence support? And this is an inception level problem, layers on layers. But much like everything else that I found in motivation science, someone else has always done it before, it seems. It's almost like there's a whole bunch of really smart people who've been studying this problem for 40 years. And if I could just Google it, which I literally did, you find that they've worked on this problem and actually come up with some pretty cool answers. Like John Marshall Reeves has been studying how do you help teachers learn autonomy support for, how long has John Marshall Reeves been studying that? 25, 30 years? Seems useful. And unfortunately, I could summarize this meta-analysis pretty quickly, and that's it takes time. It's going to take a lot of time to actually support the basic to support their psychological needs enough to see the impact, to see the purpose, and to really get engaged with the material. He also presented last year and put this really great slide that was a checklist of all of the features of our intervention. If we just did these things, it would be great. And you can totally take that picture, and it's well worth your time. Unfortunately, it's brilliant, but it's also pretty boring. And so we needed to spice it up. And we took the major features that we knew we needed to hit. We knew there was going to need to be a workshop. In fact, there was probably going to have to be a bunch of workshops. We knew there was going to have to be a lot of discussions among these coaches about how they were supporting their clients' autonomy in their daily interactions with the coaches. So make sure that they got a lot of time to talk with each other and reinforce that new behavior and that new way of thinking. We knew we were going to have to support them for quite a while, because this is a process that's going to take a long time. But most importantly, and the thing that we spent the most time trying to get right and working with the coaches in order to get right, was that this was a skills-based problem. Supporting basic psychological needs is a skill. It's a mindset, it's a series of new habits, but all of that stuff takes time and practice in context. So we were going to have to design an intervention to scaffold them into this new way of seeing most of their clients' problems, which are motivation problems. So this is my employee Omar, and he and I went to New York and holed up and worked with a number of their coaches on Skype to try to figure out all the ways we could do it. And I'm very lucky because Omar is brilliant and non-boring. I'm just not boring. And we were able to hash out a system of modules that we called the Essentials of Habit Coaching. There are 18 modules and probably another 5 to 6 within each one. Every time we made it this big, we found out we needed to make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But after we had this collection of skills and ways, it broken down into each psychological need so that they understood what they were learning, all of which we basically just took from Jennifer's book. It's a handy way to learn. It's just someone else has already done it. And then we had our skills training. We used the context they were already in, which is the most active Facebook group I've ever seen. And they didn't want to be anywhere else. They were like, no, we don't want a forum, we don't want an app, we don't want any of this. We just want to be here, we want to be in the community that we feel safe in, and we want to have these discussions. We used an off-the-shelf screen scraper to grab those conversations so that we could look at what the conversations were going on and then give them feedback about those conversations. And then we developed a series of workshops. It started out as just me talking into Skype with all these people in the UK. Then we recorded those, and then we narrowed them down into a series of smaller ones. So it was just me talking at first, and now it's actual written scripts and talking to camera. But the coolest thing we did, and this was unfortunately not my idea, this was the owner of Lift the Bar, he wanted a print magazine. He wanted a print magazine because one of the interesting problems of the coaches was they often forget that they need to learn about motivation science because they really love their subject area expertise. They love learning about picking up heavy stuff, how much calories are in this protein shake, like all of that stuff they want to learn about. But he wanted a way to keep putting it in front of their face that this is an important thing. And for that, we do a print magazine once a quarter. It's called The Motivator. We started with a 60-page one that we did. It's a research review. That was way too much work, and they didn't read it all, so now we do like a 5-page one. But it was enough to keep them engaged with the material and enough to keep them, just kind of remind them that this needed to come up. We've been doing this about 6 months, and the results are, well, we don't have any great quantitative data for you, so I'm going to show you quotes. This is a gym in Scotland called Reactive Fitness. And the owner of this gym was talking to new people joining Lift the Bar and telling them why they would want to take this course that we developed. It's long. It's like a year. And he said, this is great. It's made me feel so excited when I read the first line. I don't think we're helping people get better or faster results. It's like, yay, thanks for the sales pitch. He said, we're able to get a wider spectrum of people more consistent results by always meeting people where they're at, by always making sure that they're actually engaging with people who are amotivated, they're actually using the skills of deep listening, open-ended questions, paraphrasing, to really understand more about people and get them excited about their own experience. They were able to do that, which he says is way better. It's way better to get a broader spectrum of people, more consistent results. Increase the area under the curve. So we think this is a pretty good indication that we're supporting some psychological needs of these coaches. We think it's a pretty great start, and we've already started redesigning the whole program because we need to make things increasingly smaller. But before I go on to the things we screwed up and the lessons that we learned, I'm going to pause here for a second and ask if anyone has any questions about. I glanced over the intervention really fast because I only have 25 minutes, but I want to answer any questions about it now before we move on. Cool. It's pretty simple. But some of the neat things that happened when we started doing it is when you start teaching health coaches to support autonomy, competence, and belonging, they start actually doing it to each other. And then they start actually helping each other out. And then they start solving your problems for you. One of the big problems we had is we really love role-playing. We really love role-playing and having people try these skills out with other people in a safe context. But we couldn't really figure out how to do this from a 17-hour plane flight away. So they organically formed clubs that meet up in various cities in the UK to practice their role-playing skills. They go to each other's gyms and practice. They call each other on the phone and do Skype. And this was just an organic thing that grew up out of them going, we need to do this more, and supporting their autonomy to go do that. They've been involved in every step of this process, and the more that they learn about autonomy support, the more they're doing it for each other in the group, the more they're doing it for their clients, and the more their clients are doing it to each other. So that is a crazy force multiplier. They're doing things like, instead of teaching one person teaching a whole class, a coach will be running 2 or 3 classes simultaneously with a single designated peer expert running those classes for them, because all those clients have learned, they're supporting the client's autonomy because they want to do that. It's organic, they don't make them do it. But things like that just start happening if you keep this hot tub bubbling and everyone's basic psychological needs are more consistently getting met. So let's jump into the things that we screwed up royally. This was us after that New York excursion. Biggest mistake we made. You have to make the skills so much smaller. How many people here know what an open-ended question is? Yay, it's a question that doesn't end with yes or no. It can't be answered with yes or no. Thought that was pretty simple. We needed to have about 5 lessons before we started asking them to ask open-ended questions. Now, the first thing we do is we ask them to identify open-ended questions. Is this an open-ended question or a closed-ended question? Like as a little test on the screen. And then we give them open-ended questions to practice asking. We call them pocket questions. Like, here's one. Here's a list. Pick one that you think you might like to try, and then use it and go report back to the group on how it went, or role play with it. So everything had to get so much smaller, and the tools that we used to do that, because once again, turns out that someone else has done a lot more research on it, and we didn't have to, is Sebastian Dieterding's Lens of Intrinsic Skill Atoms, which is like a user's manual for how to create, they're gameful experiences, but really they're excuses for really deep, unctuous, delicious feedback. So this is a fantastic tool. If you just like, how do I go support a whole lot of competence really fast? Lens of Intrinsic Skill Atoms. It's actually got a workbook in it. You can just do it. Biggest frustration that we ran into, that we continually run into with teaching coaches autonomy support and motivation science in general, we're their 5th priority at best. One of our mottos is everything is optional. Like whenever we make anything, everything should be optional in order to support the autonomy. And there are lots of courses that the members of Lift the Bar can take. We're not number 1. Because they'd much rather learn about the things they're already really awesome at, like picking up heavy stuff, how much protein is in a protein shake. They want to take those nutrition courses and things like that. They don't necessarily want to do really difficult, hard things like have difficult conversations about the meaning of life with their clients. That's a big, scary thing. So they'll avoid that. We're their 5th priority, but we have to be okay with that. We have to design it with that in mind. Biggest surprise? This is still surprising to me. Holy shit, they love being graded. They love feedback. That we started making them report cards. And then we actually started getting them to give report cards to each other, and they're based on that skills framework. And they're all progress-based. There's like Duolingo as opposed to like you're failing. But they love them. They're their favorite thing. Because coaches are almost always working by themselves. And it's a really fuzzy, nebulous job. So we don't know if we're good at it. We don't know if we're getting better at it. So any feedback was like manna from heaven. They loved it. And that realization has given us, as we make further iterations on this intervention, a new way of thinking about the intervention itself, which I got is a quote from someone else I interviewed for my podcast, The Better Cast, in case you haven't noticed those little things at the bottom. It's Julie Dirksen, who's a learning intervention designer. And she said on an upcoming episode that you can listen to if you subscribe, said that I design feedback. The experiences I create are just an excuse for me to give meaningful feedback. the actual learning takes place in the interaction with getting the feedback and the deep reflection that the people are having about that experience. So think feedback, work your way backwards to how do I how can I earn the excuse to give this person this feedback? That seemed to be a really great way of teaching coaches who were just so desperate for that feedback. That is the things that we screwed up, the things that we're hoping to get a lot better. And as we continue developing this intervention and making little smaller ones for new coaches, you can feel free to ask me how they're going, emailing me, stevo@habitry.com, or you can, again, just check out our podcast, which is featuring real stories of people getting better at stuff, at betterish.co/bettercast. So thanks, Dustin, for letting me be up here among all the people's ideas I stole. That's really great. And thanks for listening to our wonderful journey of creating an intervention that we had no idea we were going to be doing. So thanks very much.
Any questions for Steve directly, and then we'll take a few for the group.
Just a tactical question.
Yeah.
You talked about a slide a couple back where you talked about a toolkit or a checklist. Can you put that slide back?
Yeah, I'd be happy to put up the slide that says there is no checklist. I would be happy to do that. And I'm doing it because I think it's a fantastic. There is unfortunately no check. Oh, John Marshall's slide? My bad. The slide that had the most dense content? Yeah. This guy. Sure. There you go. One of the things that we notice with coaches is that they get this stuff very quickly, and then they immediately start abusing the privilege of having learned it. One of the things that happens when they see it is they start seeing it as a checklist, and if I just do these things, but if I still try to control my client, make them feel stupid, I'm doing the things on the checklist, so it's totally fine. Like, I'm supporting their basic psychological needs, even if I don't actually feel an unconditional positive regard for them as a human. Yeah.
I think he was talking about the lens of intrinsic skills. Was that the one that had a workbook in it?
Yeah, much farther.
Okay.
Towards the end.
Right here. Dieterding. We have to get through the animation, then you'll see it. It's the lens of intrinsic skill items. It's on his site, codingconduct.cc.
I just shot a link through Twitter as well. You can grab it directly now.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. That you've had your hand up.
No, I was curious to see if you got any feedback from the coaches' clients on just the shift that they perhaps experienced yourself.
Yes. And their experience of it is pretty interesting. They loved, they felt like their coaches got them more, and all it was just them asking just more questions for the most part. And the feedback was stuff like, it was all related. It was related to relatedness more than anything else. They said stuff like, I feel like my coach likes me. I feel like I'm welcome here. It had a lot more to do with about the community than necessarily the relationship with the coach, because a lot of them were working out at gyms and participating in online communities. So that was the first major change. They started speaking a lot more about the experience they were having and the relationships that they were making. So that was the first piece of feedback that we got from them. Hi, yeah. Oh, are you gonna cut me off? She had a question.
Yes, but we could transition. I know we've got a few minutes left. I want to make sure folks if there are questions held over for any of the other speakers, we have a moment to get one or two out. We're right in between now and lunch, but let's do that. We can start with the one that was already aiming towards Steve-O, and then we can move on from there.
Can you talk about how you envision the concept of health coach with our theme of the challenge like this year, caregivers? Because I see caregivers are being constantly educated, but they're never put into, I guess it's probably a general question for everyone. They're constantly stressed and overworked, and they're themselves are no longer motivated. And but they were put on the spot of being like sort of a coach educator for their family members who are kind of somewhat incapable, staying like motivated. Can you talk about the potential of using caregiver as health coaches and some design challenges or benefits, or if it's still a feasible idea?
I can speak to some of that. So one of the areas that I used to work in a lot was with cardiac couples. So someone who had just had an acute event, so heart attack, bypass, whatever, and then working with their partner as well. I don't necessarily think of this as a skills-based kind of intervention. So one of the key things about cardiac spouses, and this happens in cancer as well, is that the spouses themselves actually have higher stress levels on and have worse outcomes, in part because they're being thrust into this role of being caregiver. They don't feel like they have the right to have their feelings about whatever's going on, or that somehow they have to be strong in order to help this other person navigate this health event. And so one of the things that we did in the intervention that I designed was really working on how to create a dialogue for that person to also have a voice, and for them to be able to think about how this plays out in terms of how they interact, that dynamic that we were talking about in terms of behavior change. So if I'm a spouse and I am watching my partner who's just had a heart attack eat a greasy slice of pizza, right? Chances are I'm going to start getting pretty hypervigilant, coming after them about that behavior change, and in fact doing more things that are about trying to clamp down on them from doing that behavior. This is a common dynamic that you hear in after these kinds of events. So really it's about how to stop that behavior to begin with and talk more about, why am I feeling compelled to do that, right? So I'm scared about your mortality, I'm scared about losing you. It's the relatedness piece. And really beginning to attend to that part helps them to change their dynamic about those health behavior changes and be able to have a more open dialogue about, well, you know, what's going on for the client. Because the other thing with the client or the patient is that they're oftentimes right out of the gate after an event feeling pretty incompetent in a lot of ways, because they've gone from being high-functioning folks to needing other people to take care of them, needing other people to serve functions that, you know, they can't do immediately. However, that quickly changes, so they start to try to transition back, and their spouses or others are like, don't walk too fast, don't do this too much, right? Like, limit your behaviors. And they're really feeling like, oh man, I just want to get back to being me, right? So there's a huge identity piece around that. So really, when you start to focus on it, it's not so much the skills piece, it's really about the emotion and relatedness regulation kind of piece that happens, or the dynamic between folks, and intervening on that has a huge impact on how well they navigate those health behavior changes that come after something like an event, or managing other kinds of recovery.
I would just add, I had a reaction to that, which is I would avoid contextualizing the caregiver as a health coach, even though in many ways they do play that role, just because the caregiver role is already so stressful, and it's a real shift in the relationship you may already have with that person. So adding that title seems to, in my mind, burden that person with responsibility that may be counterproductive. So I would hesitate to put a caregiver into a, you know, quote unquote health coach training, even if some of the skills or the behaviors may look very similar.
It'll tend to make them more controlling.
One of the things that comes up a lot for health coaches when we're working with them is asking if they should, and conversations around training and working with their family members. And we don't tell them not to, but we certainly ask a lot of questions about why that would be a good idea. So even the flip side, I think aligning those two roles is risky.
You have a question. Thank you. So I'm a clinical psychologist focusing on tobacco cessation. Thank you for your presentation. It was great.
I called on the right person.
I'm very curious about who the intervention is going to be marketed to and how. Is it going to be direct to consumer, or through like corporate wellness, or some other way of getting clients, and what it would cost? Because as you mentioned in your presentation, smokers today tend to be lower income and they may not have much money for something like this. So I'm curious about those issues.
Yeah, so I feel like the marketing people should be up here for this, but we're developing a B2B approach. So we'll be selling to health plans and to the employee wellness market. And then that is how individual consumers will be able to access it. It'll be something that's available as part of their benefits package primarily.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm going to have to stop us there. There's probably delicious lunch or something out there waiting for you. So thank you all very much for coming and spending 2 hours with us. And please give one more round of applause to our amazing, esteemed panel. Thank you so much. And if you have questions for individuals, I'm sure they'll be available if you can catch them in the hall. But they're very fast.